Okay, our first speaker is Jeremy Thomas, who is pastor in Fredericksburg, Texas, and he's been there about 14 years. He's a graduate of Texas Tech. I think you're a pre-med or something, biology or, yeah. And this guy was involved in a lawsuit early on, you know, but I'll let him tell you about it if he feels like doing it. And he went to Tyndale Seminary and has been a pastor there in Kerrville, Texas, which is a pretty nice place. The hill, Fredericksburg, I'm sorry. Y'all know I'm pretty sorry, don't you? But nevertheless, in Fredericksburg, because I used to live in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That's why I brought that up the other day. But yes. I'll quit talking. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tommy.
It's getting worse.
Good morning. So yeah, Tommy mentions the old days at Texas Tech, Red Raiders, and some of you are living there now. That's good. Y'all are holding down the fort, right? I don't know if you could hold down that fort, but anyway, yeah, those are some interesting years as I was studying, you know, to get my bachelor's in science and biology, and one of the professors there that actually had previously been Roman Catholic and taught at Notre Dame as adjunct faculty, but somehow ended up at Texas Tech in the biology department. And he taught biology for majors. It was just introductory freshman courses, but he was known to be sort of the litmus test. If you can't get past this guy's class, then, and he had like 60 to 70% failure rate, then you know you're not going to make it in this field. But another reason you couldn't make it very far in that field was because he had certain criteria that you have to sign off on to go to graduate or medical schools, and one of those criteria was simply was of course your grades. You have to have, you know, A's and that type of thing. Also, he had to personally know you, be able to recommend you, comment positively on your character, that type of thing. But the third criteria that he had was he wanted to know your answer to this particular question. And this is a quote: "How did the human species originate?" And of course, when he asked me that question, the temperature shot up about 30 degrees in the room, because you knew that this is the all-important question. He's standing at the fence and he's guarding the gate to go into further education in these fields. And if you don't give him the answer that he's looking for, you're not going to pass through, you know, with his recommendation, which is the recommendation you wanted at Tech. You wanted it from this gentleman. So, you know, I was able to affirm that I did not believe that the human species originated by a means of the evolutionary story. And so that ended up being what hindered me from going in that direction in life. But what it did was open a whole nother door to move this direction in life. And so that's 20 years ago. That was 1999. So it seems like a long time ago. I think I'd already met my soon-to-be wife, Robin, and her family. And so from there on, you know, I got involved in Charles Clough's ministry, studying through his framework that he'd done in the 70s, and just really studying those things and polishing up. And of course, I was fascinated because with a biology background, you know, all I could think about was the analytics of, you know, the age of the earth, radioactive decay, and all these things. And he's covering this stuff. You know, in biblical material, he's actually has scientific stuff in there, you know, because God has spoken to every area of life, and every area of life equally. And so this just opened up and broadened my way of thinking, my horizons about, you know, the God of the Bible, and that he's touched everything, and that we can't go into any area of life and not see it touched by him. And so we're searching constantly to connect every area of life to him. And this was fascinating to me. So it set me on this journey, which has ended, you know, being in the pastorate now for almost 14 years, and here before you today. And I get to speak about our Lord's greatest prophetic discourse, the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and I won't go into 25. I'll leave that for Robbie the next hour. But some people thought that my paper is thematic, just dealing generally with the question, are there any kinds of general signs or something like that in the present church age which signal his coming? But that's not what it's about. It's more of a exposition and detailing of the early portion of the Olivet Discourse. So I will be working with Matthew 23:37 to 24:31. And Robbie, Dr. Robert Dean, I should say, in this company, will be speaking from chapter 24, verse 32 through chapter 25, verse 46. So you already see from the structure of our paper that we see the division, the shift, if you might say, in the discourse after 24:31, when the angels are sent to gather the elect nation, and verse 32, where the Lord says, now learn the parable of the fig tree. So the construction of our papers is actually communicating something, because there are views that hold that the division is actually in verse 36 with the peri day, but now. And the reason this is important, that we've structured it differently, is because the arguments for the peri day in 24:36 being the division point are based almost exclusively off of Paul's usage of peri day, now concerning in the book of 1 Corinthians. He uses it in chapter 7 to change topics. Chapter 8, chapter 12, chapter 16, he uses peri day repeatedly to change the subject matter. But if you actually study Matthew's use of peri day, I'm not trying to steal all of Robbie's thunder, he'll talk about all these things in more detail. But he uses it 4 times, and not once does Matthew use it in the way that Paul does as a change of subject. There's another usage that Matthew is employing, and I'll leave that for him. But what we see is that in verse 32, when he begins with the words, now learn the parable, that he's going to now apply the truths that he's taught in chapter 24, verse 4 to 31, to the generation that sees these things. In other words, what should that generation's response be when they begin to see these things take place? So the main part of my paper, even though it's 23:37 to 24:31, the main part is going to deal with verses 4 to 14. And the reason is because there continues to be disagreement among us as dispensationalists as to what these verses are exactly referring to. So I'm going to have to, quote from and talk about the views of many men whom I greatly admire and respect and have served as instruments of God to help develop my theology. Men like Darby and Gabelin and Schaeffer and Schofield and Walbert and Ryrie and Fruchtenbaum and many others. And when I do, I have to disagree with many of them on many points. But I have to do that because guess what? They all also disagreed with one another on these same points. So you can only take one position. We hold in hermeneutics that interpretation is one and application is many. So we can't have multiple interpretations that are all correct. Ultimately, there can only be one that's correct. And I trust that those who I will quote and those of you who I know and love and who I disagree with are all ultimately textual people. You want to know the intent of the author. And that author is ultimately or primarily God, spoken through human authors, to record and inscripturate for us truth. And so that's my whole approach. So if I disagree with you, I do it in humility and out of love and appreciation for all that you have brought to the body of Christ through your teachings and so forth. So what I'm going to do is basically divide my paper into 2 parts. The first part is going to be simply a sketch and analysis of the various views that modern dispensationalists hold. So by modern dispensationalists, I'm beginning with Darby. If you want to know what they held before, you can just talk to Bill. Okay? Because he covered that last year, he covered that this year, and he's got a book, and he's got another book. And I do highly recommend those books. Get them to as many people as you can. I give them to all my missionaries when they come back because they have a hard time getting these things. So give them these good books. It's funny because some of them try to bring me books. Like some of them try to bring me some of Paul Wilkinson's books, and I go, oh, I got those books. And they're like, oh, great. So it's wonderful to know that these books are getting spread around the world through some of our missionaries. But that's going to be the first part of our paper. And the second part is going to be simply a proposed interpretation that's consistent with Matthew's overall argument. And I'll talk more about that in detail when I get to that section, about the importance of viewing the discourse in the context of Matthew's overall argument that he's making to first century Jewish believers. All right, so the views of Matthew 24, 4-14 by modern dispensationalists fall into two basic categories. Those that are, first of all, historical futurists, they're going to view portions of Matthew 24, 4-14 as being fulfilled in history during the church age, or being in the process of being fulfilled now in the church age, and other parts as having a future fulfillment only during the 70th week of Daniel. Those are your two basic approaches, this is your first basic approach. The other approach is those that follow just strict futurism, and they're going to view all of Matthew 24, 4-14 as being fulfilled in the future during the 70th week of Daniel. So I'm going to move now to these first set of views held by modern dispensationalists. This is an in-house discussion. I'm not looking at what views non-dispensationalists have of the discourse, although it's interesting to study. But my main discussion is an in-house discussion amongst ourselves, and to hopefully polish and work through some of these issues. So let's start with the historical future views. And I'm going to move basically starting back with Darby, and I'm going to move historically forward, giving an older representative and then one that's more modern that holds something similar. I'll do this each time I look at a view. The first one's called the Intercalation view. It may not be the best term because intercalation means a gap in a calendar. But I didn't choose gap because I thought, well, the people think I'm talking about the gap theory or something. Or I could have used parenthesis, but anyway, there was no really good term, so I just chose intercalation to communicate the idea that these authors saw some kind of a gap in the first 14 verses, somewhere, between fulfillments in an earlier period of church history and those that will be fulfilled in the future. So Darby considered the discourse to concern the Jewish people in Jerusalem as the center of the system that's before God. And the subject, he said, is God's government of the earth and the judgments that will take place at Christ's coming that will put an end to the existing age. He said verses 4-14 speak of the general condition of the disciples and of the world during the time of the testimony. Well, then what's the time of the testimony, we would ask Darby? Well, he says the time of the testimony is whenever the gospel of the kingdom is being administered. The gospel of the kingdom is being administered in the land. Darby was extremely land-centered when it came to the discourse. And he says this administration of the gospel of the kingdom occurs as long as there's a people, a Jewish temple, and a city. So that helps us a lot because that means that verses 4-14 in Darby's view were fulfilled between AD 30 and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That means there's a gap. He had a gap between verse 14 and verse 15. And there's a continuation of fulfillment that will take place, he says, when the time of the abomination of desolation takes place. So I've got quotes of all these things in the paper. If you want to read that, I'm just going to give you the overview. His interpretation, though, was very strongly related again to the Jews in the land, with a city of Jerusalem, a temple, and so forth. And in light of the modern state of Israel, which he lived long before, as long as what we would have thought he would have thought about the establishment of the modern state in 1948, the establishment or Jewish control of the Temple Mount and so forth happening in 1967, we don't know what he would have thought. But as far as his synopsis is concerned, he only mentions future events that relate to a temple in the 70th week. Now, interestingly, Toussaint followed in his commentary, Behold the King, a similar, let's say, gap or intercalation approach, in that he saw verses 4-6 being fulfilled to the disciples between AD 33 and AD 70. And then he saw a gap, of course, between verse 6 and 7. And once you get to verse 7, he said these things will be fulfilled in the first half of the tribulation. So that's an intercalation type of view, similar to Darby's. And there's some strengths to this view, of course. The strength that both of these men brought to the table is that they saw the discourse as related to Israel only. Even when they saw some fulfillment during the church age, the emphasis was still on the Jewish disciples. The emphasis was still on the Jewish land, the Jewish temple, the Jewish people, this type of thing. So that's a strength. But there are some faults or some weaknesses. And the first of these is that there were no false Christs between AD 30 and 70. Gentry and DeMar said, oh yeah, there's false Christs. But actually, the people they identified were false prophets. And of course, a false prophet is not a false Christ. They're very distinct. So, as Tommy I said, we'll quote him first. You're welcome. He says, we possess no historical record of any false messiahs having appeared previous to the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's very unlikely then, as you look at their view, that verses 4 to 6 or 4 to 14 were fulfilled in the early church before AD 70. The second weakness is that in this view, the birth pangs are not adequately dealt with. Darby claimed that the birth pangs began in verse 4, and verse 4 is fulfilled between AD 30 and AD 70. That doesn't work very well with the birth pangs because by definition, the birth pangs do not begin in the early days of the pregnancy. They become in the final hours of the pregnancy. And Toussaint got around this by saying, well, the birth pangs don't begin until verse 7, which he placed in the tribulation. Which is nice, but it's arbitrary because why did you exclude verses 4 and 5? I mean, grammatically, why did you do that? What are the reasons you might do that? So the third weakness is this. There's an intercalation in fulfillment that's contrary to the illustration of the fig tree. Okay, so this is Matthew 24, 32 to 35. And what you have there is the Lord telling them to learn a parable or learn something concerning this fig tree, right? Now, what he presents is the growing pattern of the fig tree. And by the way, Luke says all the trees. So it's the fig tree, all the trees, it doesn't matter. We're looking at the growing pattern of trees. When you see the leaves bud forth, what do you know? Well, you know that summer's near. I mean, you don't know exactly when it's coming, but you have good indications, right? That it's right around the corner. He says, so it will be in the coming of the day, coming of the Son of Man. So what the fig tree illustration is teaching us, and he goes on to say that the generation that sees all these things will not pass away, right? So he's saying that the things in chapter 24, verses 4 to 26, are the indications, they're the buds on the fig tree, if you will, to indicate that his coming is near. It's right around the corner. So this view does not really deal well with the fig tree analogy, because what generation did not pass away until they saw all these things? See, if you've got a generation in the first century that saw things fulfilled then, and then a future generation, that obviously their lives don't span all these things. So it's not dealing really satisfactorily with the fig tree illustration. And we'll come back to that over and over. So the way that you have to get around that is you have to identify this generation as something other than just a group of people at a certain time in history. What you have to do is you have to say, well, He Gene Alte means something like the nation Israel. And you have to argue something along the lines of, well, the nation Israel will not go out of existence until all these things have taken place. But that's a non-contextual interpretation, because that's not the meaning of what the fig tree illustration is all about. Okay, so that's just a short evaluation of their intercalation view. But I do want to make note of the fact that I received a paper that was done by John Minson at a Baptist Bible seminary back in the 70s. And his paper is an interesting evaluation of dispensationalist interpretation through time of Matthew 13 and the parables there. But what he does in this paper is he also shows at key strategic points how the interpretation of Matthew 13 and the parables there was affecting what's going on with their interpretation of Matthew 24. And so it's a fascinating study. And what happened is, well, this paper cites, I know you can't read all this, but cites a number of authors down through modern dispensationalism and what views they held on various passages. And the column second to the far right is what did they do with Matthew 24, 4-14. And when this was passed to Dr. Toussaint to read, he made little marks down there about what he believed. And if he just believed what the person said above him, say Dr. Pentecost, he would just put little quotes like we might. Instead of write it again, just put quotes. And that's exactly what he did on Matthew 24, 4-14. And Dr. Pentecost's view was its tribulation period entirely. So, people shift and change their views. And I just wanted to point this out, and this will be evidence that's in your paper. You'll have access to this. That at some point he held to this view that no, verses 4-14 are not an intercalation as I presented to you, but actually entirely future. Okay, let's look at the general and specific view that falls in the historical future views camp. This is Schofield. He's viewing verses 4-14 as a general description of just the church age that gathers into an awful intensity at the end of the age. And by the end of the age, he means the end of the 70th week of Daniel. So he saw the gospel of the kingdom there in verse 14. It'd be nice to have your Bible open because we'll be in this text all the time. He saw the gospel of the kingdom in verse 14 as being preached by the Jewish remnant in the 70th week. He says, during the great tribulation and immediately preceding the coming of the King in glory. So he saw general moving to specific in this period. Walvoord followed Schofield very closely. He said basically exactly the same thing. Now, this view, while it is somewhat vague, it does have the strength of seeing verse 14 as the very end of the Great Tribulation. And that's what it says. But there are a number of deficiencies as well. And the first one is the biggest trouble, and that's that it is a double interpretation. Schofield even said, quote, verses 4-14 have a double interpretation. Well, we know that interpretation is one. If we allow multiple interpretations to be correct, then what's hindering us, our imagination, from developing all types of layers of interpretation like Dr. House spoke of yesterday. We could have maybe 7 layers of interpretation, whereas they only had 2. But the point is that there's no controls anymore. And so this became problematic. The second problem is that, again, it doesn't deal adequately with the birth pangs. If all of verses 4-14 are the birth pangs in general throughout the church age, and specifically the birth pangs during the tribulation, then doesn't that make the entire church age the birth pangs? But see, that's too broad of an understanding. The Old Testament described the birth pangs as a specific set of pains the world would undergo in connection with the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is not a natural order of events that we're living in today. So it's too broad of an understanding. The third problem is that, again, it's contrary to the illustration of the fig tree. Because once you have mentioned that these things occur in a general or fulfilled in a general way through the church age, and then they'll be fulfilled in a specific way at the end, well, what is the generation that saw all these things? It can't be a generation that spans almost 2,000 years now. So you'd have to change your meaning of he, gene, aute. You'd have to do something with that generation to make it fit. All right, let's go to the chronological. I've just titled these. You can call them something else if you like. I just tried to give some title that characterized the view. Chronological, historic, and future. And we start with Schaeffer again. Schaeffer, the early adherent to this view. Schaeffer insisted that Jesus is addressing Israel. This is really good. Not the church. He made clear that the church is an intercalation in God's 70-week calendar with Israel. And he began this intercalation with the triumphal entry. And he states on this discourse, there's not a thing here ever connected to the church and to the true Christian that is addressed to them or may be applied to them. He goes on to insist that the disciples knew nothing of the church age or anything even of a church at all. And his view was that verses 4-5 are warning Jews not to accept a false Christ. Verses 4 to 8 they're all events of the church age that will lead up to the tribulation. And he says, this period of time is unknown. And he says the church will be raptured in Matthew 24:8, even though Jesus didn't mention it. That's where he held it would take place. In 24:9, he said is the beginning of the first half of the tribulation. Okay? Now, he outlined his view. It was about 1947, as far as there was no date on what I read, but as far as from what I could tell from what he was saying, it was just before the establishment of the modern state of Israel, which he believed that would happen, obviously, before it happened. He was just reading the text. I don't know exactly how much weight he would put on something like World War I and World War II, or earthquakes or pestilences or things like that, but he definitely saw significance to the establishment of the modern state of Israel being very near on the horizon. And he seems to think that the rapture could take place, very, very soon. Now, Cooper and Fruchtenbaum outline a refined version of Chafer's view. Cooper seems to argue that verses 4 and 5 are false messiahs that would appear to the apostles. We already mentioned, as far as history is concerned, we don't know of anybody who claimed to be a false messiah between those years. But that seems to be his view. Now, Fruchtenbaum argued that false messiahs would appear throughout the church age, and he cites several who have appeared, starting with Bar Kokhba, that revolt in AD 132 to 135. This seems to add legitimacy to the idea that verses 4 and 5 are being fulfilled throughout the church age. Further, both Cooper and Fruchtenbaum argued that wars and rumors of wars in chapter 24, verse 6 there, will take place throughout the church age. Since these are local wars, these are not prophetically significant because they do not herald the end. And they interpret 24/7, nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom, as World War I, both of them. Of course, Cooper only writes after World War I, but before World War II. And World War II as well for Fruchtenbaum. And they add in verse 7 the famines and earthquakes to World War I and World War II to show that together this heralds the beginning of the birth pangs. So the birth pangs would begin with these events and continue to this day. And then verse 9, as you can see from the chart, is the beginning of the first half of the tribulation. This view, of course, has much to commend it. There have been false messiahs throughout much of the church age. There have been wars, local wars, rumors of wars. There have been large conflicts like World War I and World War II. There have been earthquakes and famines in a variety of places. But there are also some deficiencies. First, it seems from the text that the wars in verse 6 and 7 are the same wars, not different wars. In other words, not local and global or something, but the same wars, as evidenced by the explanatory gar that begins verse 7. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So what is happening here in these two verses is the wars and rumors of wars in verse 6 are being explained by kingdom against kingdom, nation rising against nation in verse 7. That's a function of the explanatory gar. Clarification gar is to actually just expound more or clarify what has just been spoken about. So the two types of wars don't seem to be really two types, but one's simply an explanation of what the other is like. What it would mean then is that coalitions of nations will be rising against coalitions of nations. These are large-scale conflicts that are taking place. Now, second, it seems to me and to several others that it's too speculative to argue that World War I and World War II fulfill verse 7. Kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation. Now, the argument is that, of course, this is an idiom. It points to total conflict within the area in the context. The total area in the context in the all of the discourse is the whole world. So the conclusion is that the first time such a global conflict occurred was World War I. But really, historians are still arguing over whether World War I was really the first truly global war. Others argue that it was perhaps the 7 Years' War or the Napoleonic Wars that preceded them, because battles were fought in these wars on several different continents. Even when it comes to World War I, we know that the main fronts were in the European theater. Now, World War II is different because we've got a European front, we've got a Pacific front, Battles are being fought on several continents. None are fought on American soil, though they are fought on American sea. It really all comes down to, how does one define a world war? And does it mean that you have to have fighting on every continent? Or does it mean that in some way the war has to impact economically or some other way every continent? What exactly are we talking about? But the point is that this is still under debate, and so when it is, of course, one should be cautious about concluding that it fulfilled these verses. Third, the expression nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom is better connected to the second seal in Revelation 6:4. The phrase's idiomatic meaning, total conflict of the area in view, fits perfectly with the second seal in Revelation 6:4, when the rider of the red horse is granted to take peace from the earth. That is truly a global conflict. It occurs in the first half of the tribulation, so why not connect Jesus' words of Matthew 24:7 with those of Revelation 6:4? Wouldn't it be better to make that connection than it would to possibly speculate that World War I and World War II perhaps, probably fit the bill, but maybe not? Even Cooper was cautious on this point and said, here one must be very cautious and avoid dogmatism, though I would say he was very convinced that World War I fulfilled this passage. Now the fourth problem is that the earthquake data from the 20th century show a slight decrease in both the frequency of earthquakes as well as the intensity of earthquakes during the 20th century. Biblical creationist and geologist Steve Austin points out from the data from the National Earthquake Information Center that in the 20th century there is an overall slight decrease in earthquake frequency, and that during the latter half of the 20th century there's a slight decrease in earthquakes that register 7.0 or greater on the Richter scale relative to the earlier half of the 20th century. So in light of this, wouldn't it be better to connect Jesus' mention of earthquakes there in 24:7 to the earthquake in the sixth seal in Revelation 6:12-17? There we're told that there was a great shaking or earthquake, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. So it might be better to make that connection rather than to present-day earthquakes. The fifth weakness is that it doesn't deal adequately with the birth pangs. At least it's starting to look that way more and more. In other words, here's what we're saying, is that if the birth pangs began with World War I, what generation is it that's going to see all these things? You see, I kind of tie this to the next argument. What generation is it? Next year it'll be 100 years since the end of World War I, right? Not many people are going to be alive from then at all. When are they going to see the other things that are scheduled to happen in Matthew 24, such as the abomination of desolation and so forth and so on? That's going to be beyond their lifetime. So it seems to not fit very well with the concept of birth pangs. That's too long for the birth pangs to go on. And we have not seen an escalation in wars. You know, we had World War I, then World War II you could say is an escalation. But where's World War III? When you have birth pangs, they get closer together and they get more intense. That didn't happen. We saw these conflicts, but then it did not continue to escalate. So that just leaves questions. Okay. The last weakness I'll point out is 24:9 is not a good description of what will happen to Israel at the beginning of the tribulation. This view says that verse 9 is the beginning of the first half of the tribulation. But you see, this verse is not a good description of what happens to them. What happens to Israel at the very beginning of the tribulation? We all know from Daniel 9:27 that the leadership enter into league or treaty with the Antichrist. And they have some type of protection, so they're able to offer sacrifice and so forth up to the midpoint in the temple system. But verse 9 says what? Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. That doesn't happen at the beginning to Israel. That happens at the midpoint, doesn't it? So 24:9 is not a good description of the first half of the tribulation, but it is a very good description of the beginning of the second half. Now, having said that, what verses in Matthew 24, 4-14, what verses would give a good depiction of the first half, the beginning of the first half? What about verse 5? The rise of a deceiver, a false Christ. That would be a very good description. And the warning to not be deceived. That would be an excellent depiction of what happens at the beginning of the 70th week when the Antichrist makes the covenant with the leadership. So verses 9-14 are not a good description of the first half of the tribulation. It's a better description of the second half. So that concludes the historic futurist views, the three that I've looked at. They include the intercalation view of Darby and Toussaint, who have some kind of a gap in the fulfillment. It also includes the general and specific views of Schofield and Walvert, who had a double interpretation, general moving to specific, and the chronological, historic, and future views of Schaeffer, Cooper, and Fruchtenbaum. And so now what we're going to do is just turn to the futurist views only. We'll start with Gabeline. Gabeline is the first that I know of to argue that all of these verses are pushed in part of the 70th week of Daniel. He said everything in Matthew's gospel is Jewish in character. So he's looking at the whole book and he's saying the whole thing's Jewish. This has to be Jewish. It's got to be in the 70th week. He held that 24, 4-14 is the first half of the tribulation. And he connected 24:9 with the fifth seal, like many do, right? In Revelation 6, 9-11. And of course, verse 15, he said, begins the second half. So for his view, it's a strict sequence. You move from the first half to the midpoint, and then verse 16 and following just takes you right into the second half. Strict sequence. And he's emphatic. He says if our interpretation is right, there has to be a perfect harmony between three things. He says Old Testament prophecy, which obviously he's referring primarily to Daniel and Zechariah. And then secondly, Matthew 24, 4-44. That has to be in harmony. And then Revelation 6-19. And he was convinced there's a perfect harmony between all three of these. And of course, I would agree that that has to be true. So this was a big step because he moved away from any of it being fulfilled in church history. And he says, no, it's all got to be fulfilled in the 70th week of Daniel. And he even said, frankly, that things like wars, earthquakes, pestilence, and famine, things like that, they are all just faint shadows of what is to come at the beginning of the 70th week. Now, variations of his view are held by lots of other men like Ryrie, McLean, Bagalki, and others. Alvin McLean. McLean perhaps went the furthest in his dissertation to refine this view, and there's a lot to commend it. Okay, exegesis shows strong connection between Matthew 24, 4-14, and the seals in Revelation 6, 1-17. Such a close connection, they say that can't be incidental. That's not incidental. The birth pangs are also limited just to the 70th week. That's a strength. Okay, they begin in the first half, they become more intense till the end of the second half. So it fits well with the birth pangs metaphor. But there are a few weaknesses. The first is that it doesn't seem that Matthew 24:9 is really a description of the martyrs under the altar in Revelation 6, 9-11. If you study these seals closely, you notice that is an oddball. You read the fifth seal, the Lamb breaks the fifth seal, and what happens? Well, on earth, what happens on earth? Nothing. Or if something happens, we don't know what it is. What we see is a scene in heaven. Now you can argue from, effect back to cause. Well, these guys were martyred. That's the fifth seal. But if you study out carefully what it is, the actual fifth seal is an imprecatory prayer that seals the doom of those who killed them, who shed their blood. And the theme follows all the way down till you get into the story of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18, when that prayer is ultimately finally answered. So when they make the connection with 24:9 to the fifth seal, they're not really corresponding. Now, what has happened is an issue of the audience in Matthew 24:9. In 24:9, who is he addressing? He's saying you, right? They will deliver you. Well, who is the you? And they're going to kill you. And you're going to be hated by all nations, ethnos, all the Gentile nations, because of my name. Well, who is the you? Well, it's the future Jewish remnant, right, who's being hated by all the nations in the world. Well, that's not the fifth seal. The fifth seal is not the midpoint when that happens. Israel goes over to persecution in the midpoint. Everybody agrees with that, right? Well, how could that be at the fifth seal? That's not the fifth seal. The fifth seal, you see martyrs in general, okay? We don't know if they're Jew or Gentile. That's not the issue, okay? The issue is their prayer that seals the doom of their slayers. So this is something different. This is actually a description in verse 9 of the midpoint, not of the fifth seal. So we wouldn't want to make that connection. All right. The second weakness is that, the first half of the tribulation does not end in verse 14. Because verse 14 is the end of the birth pangs altogether. Verse 13 says, he who endures to the end will be saved. Verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world, and then what? The end will come. That's not the end of the first half of the tribulation. That's the end of the whole tribulation, right? That's the end of the second half. Immediately after that, of course, you have the coming of the Son of Man. Of course, they're going to argue, well, no, because verse 15 is the midpoint. But what we're going to see is there's a recapitulation, a very common theme in Jewish literary writing style, right? A third weakness is that the placement of that phrase, the beginning of the birth pangs, which is in verse 8, this is not the end, but these are merely the beginning of the birth pangs, that would really be in the wrong place in this view. If this is just the beginning of the birth pangs, that should be in verse 14, just before the midpoint. But verse 14 doesn't say that. Verse 14 doesn't say these are just the beginning. It says then the end will come, right? Whereas verse 6 says the end is not here. It's just the beginning of birth pangs. Verse 14 says no, then the end will come. So that indicates it's the end of the second half, not the end of the first half. So it's better than, in my opinion, a lot of the historical futurist views, but it's still not the best view. So what's the best view? You just say, could you just get to the point? I know. I felt that way too, but you got to go through all this, right? So here's the chronological future first and second half views at the bottom of this slide. Pentecost held that consistency of interpretation requires us not to apply any of this portion to the church or the church age. He suggested verses 4 to 8 refer to the first half, 4 to 8 refer to the first half of the 70th week, 9 to 14 the second half, and 24:15 is a recapitulation indicating the event that will begin the second half and lead up to the coming of the Son of Man. He said it this way: there seems to be evidence to support the view that the first half of the week is described in verses 4 to 8. The parallelism between verses 4 to 8 and Revelation 6 seems to indicate that the first half of the tribulation is here described. There are indications that verses 9 to 26 describe the events of the last half of the week. The abomination of desolation in verse 15 is clearly stated by Daniel 9:27 to appear in the middle of the week and continue to the end of the period. The word then in verse 9 seems to introduce the great persecutions against Israel that were promised them and were described in Revelation 12:12-17, where John reveals that this persecution will last for the last half of the tribulation period. I came to the view that Pentecost is holding in 2007 when I got to verse 9 and I saw the Tate, and I began to evaluate and think through all of what we knew from Daniel about their 70th week. And then I found what he said, and he seems to be saying that the then was very important for him too. As it's used, Tate is used throughout the discourse many times to advance the narrative in a sequence that's moving forward. Okay? So this view is, or a close version of it, is held by John Whitcomb, who I got to speak to last month. He's 93 years old. I called him to ask about some of the issues in some of his books, just to clarify, and he's really slowed down a lot. So he has to have his daughter-in-law kind of moderate discussions, but as always, he's super gracious, and we had a wonderful discussion about these things as he got refreshed on some of the things that he says that he used to just roll off his tongue, but now he has to work to recall and put back together. So be praying for him. But he holds this view. Barbieri holds this view in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. Reynolds Showers holds this view, Paul Inns holds this view. It's my conviction this is the best representation of what the text is teaching. It puts all of the verses in the time frame of the 70th week. It avoids speculation of what might constitute fulfillment. It also solves the problem of the illustration of the fig tree, because there will be a generation that sees all these things, and so it compacts the events together into a single growing season. And that seems to be the illustration of the fig tree. So that's a conclusion of both the historicist and the future-only views. And I'm now going to give a presentation in the second part of my paper of the argument for the chronological first and second half in verses 4 to 14. Let's start with the argument of the book. That's the argument of the Gospel of Matthew. This seems to be one of the biggest issues. Whenever we study a book, of course, or any passage, you want to know its place in the overall argument. This paper came about as a result of both Robbie and I's teaching verse by verse through the Gospel of Matthew with our people. I think he started before me, and I think I finished before him. But nevertheless, they're a pretty long series, over a couple years. And in the course of that, what you're trying to do in each pericope, right, is understand how the author is using it to contribute to his argument. That's the goal. And in the Gospel of Matthew, when people come to the Olivet Discourse and they don't consider its place in the overall argument, well, that can lead to several things. It can lead to a similarity between passages, just a word similarity, or a phrase, or just a concept being pulled out of the overall context of Matthew and used to support some argument that refers to the church age or something like the rapture. I'm sure he'll talk about that just a little bit in the next hour. But when you take all these words, phrases, similarities, and concepts inside the context of Matthew's argument, all those arguments break down. They just fall to pieces. And you'll see that there is a relationship between how authors are dealing with Matthew 13 and the parables and what they're doing over here in the Olivet Discourse. These things are all tied because we're all smart. Okay, I never think anybody is, stupid. When I read people, I'm assuming that they are trying to harmonize all the data. And that's what they should be doing. That's what we are supposed to be doing. We want to see how it all works together. My point, though, is that everything is impacting everything else. So it's complicated. Especially when you get to prophecy, there's thousands of pieces, right? What do you try to do? You try to put those pieces together in a picture, but not just any picture, the right one. Sometimes a piece seems to fit, right? And you stick it there, but guess what? Then let it go. That's not right. You take it, you put it somewhere else. That's what we're doing in studying Bible prophecy. So, Jesus gave this discourse. He gives it to the Jewish disciples. He's speaking to a future generation. Almost everybody recognizes that this gospel is very Jewish. Even from earliest times, they say it's written to Jewish believers, right? So what's his argument? Well, his argument is basically twofold. Jesus is indeed the king, even though his kingdom didn't come. No. Why didn't the kingdom come? Well, the reason the kingdom did not come is because the kingdom's arrival in history was contingent on Israel's repentance. But they didn't repent, and therefore the kingdom was postponed until a future generation of Israel comes along that does repent. What is the Olivet Discourse doing? It's presenting to us the conditions that will prevail in the world when that generation of Israel comes to repentance. Now, within the argument, of course, you have the discourses, which are a key component to Matthew, and he's well known for these. So what we want to show here is that when you look at the 5 discourses, they all tell us something about Israel and the Messianic kingdom. They're not telling us stuff about the church. They may deal with the period of the postponement, but they're not dealing with the church in particular. Okay. The first discourse is what? Well, it's the discourse, I call it the kingdom righteousness. People call it the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't tell me much. It tells me where it took place. Thanks a lot. But the discourse on kingdom righteousness, what does that teach me? It teaches us what the what kind of righteousness one generation of Israel must have for the kingdom to arrive in history. The second discourse is the discourse on kingdom missions, Matthew 10. And this discourse explains the missionary enterprise given to Israel whenever the kingdom is at hand, which that's not only in the past, that's also going to be in the future. So where's the split? Is it verse 16 in chapter 10 where there's the split between past and future in the Matthew 10 discourse? Somewhere in there. Whenever the kingdom's at hand, there's a missionary outreach to Israel on a grand scale. The third discourse is the discourse on kingdom postponement, the one we have some difficulties getting together on. And in this one, Jesus seems to be explaining new truths relative to the kingdom, concerning the kingdom, about the kingdom, mysteries. These are mysteries of the kingdom, right? And the basic mystery is that the kingdom is going to be postponed, and he gives characteristics of the age, the inter-advent age, that lead up to the kingdom's establishment. So he doesn't seem to teach that the kingdom of the heavens has a mystery form. In other words, what I'm saying here is that the meaning of the mystery, or the kingdom of the heavens, in the first 12 chapters of Matthew, continues to have the same meaning in chapters 13 and following. The meaning of that phrase does not change. And as mentioned yesterday, the last illustration he gives of taking old and new and putting them together is taking old truths about the kingdom known and now adding to that new truths about the kingdom. Okay? That's what the disciples are supposed to do. So it's a discourse about the postponement of the kingdom and what the age will be like during the inter-advent age. There's nothing in here actually about the church. Matthew 13 does not reveal the church. What's the first passage in Matthew to reveal the church? Matthew 16:18. So he's not already revealing the church. He is revealing the inter-advent age, but he's not revealing the church in specific, and I wouldn't tie it to the pearl or the treasure or something like that. But I've got a paper that I'm going to have published on this to deal with these things. So hopefully you'll be looking for that. Maybe he'll do it next year. I don't know if Tommy will accept me. The fourth discourse is Matthew 18. This is the discourse on kingdom greatness. Jesus is teaching that how a disciple must live in order to be great when the kingdom comes. And the fifth discourse is Matthew 24 and 25. And of course, this is the discourse on the kingdom coming. And it describes the conditions in the world that will result in Israel coming to repentance and issuing the return of the king and his judgments. Okay? So I brought all this up because if you don't look at the discourse inside the overall context of Matthew and what he's arguing, and see how each of the discourses relates to Israel and the Messianic kingdom and not the church, then you automatically, if you don't see these things, you can get yourself caught in thinking other things are here that are not here just because of a similarity of a word, a phrase, a concept, or something like that. But we know similarity does not mean what? It does not mean sameness. There can be lots of similarities. Tree in the bush, as Dr. House pointed out yesterday, right? Lots of similarities, but it's the differences that are important. And that's what we hope to see when we look at these words, phrases, concepts in their immediate context here, within the greater context of the argument of Matthew. All right, so let's look at the immediate context briefly. Chapter 23, verse 37 to 39. Then I'll get to my real arguments that I want to present. Jesus has just finished a scathing, rebuke to the Pharisees. And after this rebuke in verses 37 to 39, he is lamenting over Israel's rejection. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather you together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. This is his lament over that generation. Jerusalem being a personification of the people of Israel who saw Jerusalem as their eternal capital. He says in verse 38, he proclaims the destruction of the temple. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. And in verse 39, he states that he's going to depart and they're not going to see him again until they issue the messianic greeting. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Oh, I hit something. Let me play from current slide. Oh yeah, you don't have touch screen, so there we go. Did that fix that? Okay. So that gives the immediate context, right? So let's look at some of the disciples' questions. Verses 1 to 3, the disciples are coming out of the temple. What are they doing? They're pointing out the beautiful temple buildings under construction according to Herod the Great's design. They're impressed by this. Jesus remarked in verse 2 that not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. This prompted their question in verse 3 as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. At least 4 of them, Mark tells us, right? Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming into the end of the age? That's amazing. You go into the literature and you say, how many questions are here? Everybody brings that up, right? Well, some said 1, some said 2, some said 3, and some even said 4. Now, I'm not going to comment about all these views, but I do want to comment on the 2-question view. Because the 2-question view is now being promoted to present a structure of the Olivet Discourse that is absolutely critical for their argument to stand. Okay? So the 2-question view that's being proposed is basically based on the fact that, well, there's 2 interrogatives. There's a pate question, a when question, and a t question, a what question. And of course, the when question, the pate, is when will these things be or happen? And the t question, the what question, is what is the sign of your coming, even the end of the age? So they're connecting the last 2 just as one, right? Just as one question. It's 2 questions. And what is now argued, once this has been established, is that, well, Jesus is answering the questions in a chiastic format, so that the first question they asked will be answered last, and the second question they asked will be answered first. Okay? So, when will these things happen? That's the first question. It's going to be answered last. What will be the sign of your coming into the age? That question will be answered first. So, the first question there that he'll answer in verses 4 to 35 is that second question. What will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? That, they say, is answered in verses 4 to 35. And then they said this first question, when will these things happen? That's going to be answered in verses 36 and following, starting with the periday that I mentioned at the very beginning, right? But now concerning, this type of thing. Now, what happens, well, let's just see the quote. Hart, I'm talking about John Hart, he requires 2 questions to make his case because without it, there's no chiasm. Jesus answers the 2 questions, he says, in reverse order. This technique is called chiasm. He claims, okay, the question is, what is the first question? I mean, the disciples asked, when will these things happen? Right? Well, what's he talking about? What things? Hart argues that the question means, when will the events of the tribulation begin? Or when will the 70th week begin? Or when will the broad day of the Lord begin? And when he gets to verse 36 and following, of course he says, well, it's signless. There's no signs of when the tribulation is going to begin. And therefore, all of a sudden, we're looking at the 2 in the field, one taken, one left, right? And this is the rapture. And because the rapture is also a signless event. And so we have the concept of dual imminence. 2 imminent events. The beginning of the tribulation and the rapture. Okay? And, but there's one fatal flaw to the whole thing. And that's not the first question that they're asking. When will these things happen in context? The disciples aren't asking, when are the tribulation events going to begin? They're asking, what? Well, in verse 38, Jesus said, your house is being left to you desolate. In verse 1, they're pointing to the temple buildings and impressed with them. Verse 2, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, not one stone here is going to be left upon another that won't be cast down. In verse 3, they say, when are these things going to happen? Well, what things? Well, the destruction of the temple buildings. That's the question they wanted to know an answer to. So let's see how, let's look at these questions a little bit more in detail. See, once you've shown that, well, this entire argument, the whole edifice is crumbled because that's not the question that's being asked. So the first question concerns when the temple buildings would be destroyed. And most recognize that, Matthew did not answer this question. Some consider this to be egregious error that violates the inspiration of Scripture. But guess what? It got captured, the answer got captured in the inspired account in Luke, chapter 21, verses 12 to 24. Most recognize that this section in Luke records something very specific that has no parallel in Matthew or Mark. McLean explained it best. He said, "It should be obvious that in this section of Luke's account, we have the answer of Christ to the disciples' question about the judgment of Jerusalem and the temple. For here he speaks especially of the events which will occupy the time from his departure to the destruction of the city in AD 70. Okay? Now, while that seems clear, of course, many are troubled by the fact that Matthew doesn't record it. Why doesn't Matthew record it? Well, the simplest answer is that it wouldn't contribute to his argument about when the kingdom is going to come. Because while the disciples might have thought the destruction of the temple would happen in conjunction with his second coming, on the basis of Zechariah 12 to 14, it wouldn't occur in connection with those things. So while Matthew recorded the questions that the disciples were asking, he didn't record that aspect of the answer because it was unrelated to the establishment of the kingdom. Because see, look, what's happening? In Luke, he explains that the temple will be destroyed in the near time frame. We know it happened in AD 70. But all the other things, the sign of his coming and all that, that happens in a far time frame. That is very relevant to Matthew's argument. But the other is not really. So it's not a blemish on Matthew that he didn't record it. It just didn't fit his argument. So as for this, that's the first question. When are the temple buildings going to be destroyed? Now the second question, what's the sign of your coming? Now one passage that might be related to this is Zechariah 14. At least this comes to mind as you read Matthew 24, 29. You read about the luminaries dwindling. And if you study Zechariah chapter 14, verses 6 and 7, it sounds very similar, right? It's certainly the day of the second coming. In that day there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light. Now, what is the sign, of your coming? Now, they didn't know that, but we need to understand at least the question they're asking. What do they mean by coming? Well, if they're thinking anything like Zechariah, they're thinking the actual day he comes back to earth. That's the parousia, right? That's what they're asking about. What is the sign of your parousia? Now, it's not like some people have said, well, parousia is just a broad term. It's just talking about, the whole day of the Lord or the 70th week or something like that. That confuses the issue. The issue is Zechariah 14, 6 and 7, his coming when he'll put down his feet on the Mount of Olives. The parousia, that day. This is exactly what Daniel 2 is picturing in the sudden collapse or destruction of that statue on one day, right? All at one time. Daniel 7, Son of Man is given a kingdom from the Ancient of Days, an everlasting kingdom, right? It comes suddenly into history and it destroys all Gentile kingdoms instantaneously. I mentioned the Son of Man, so we talked about parousia, that's the day of the second coming. What about Son of Man? This title is used throughout the Olivet Discourse. It's used in 24:27, 24:30, 36, 37, 39, 44, 25:31, which was mentioned yesterday when he sits on the Davidic throne. Okay. Son of Man. What is the significance of this title in the scripture? Well, its origin is messianic. That's Daniel 7, 13 to 14, right? One like a son of man comes up and receives an everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days. It's messianic, it's kingdom, it's Israel. It's not the rapture. Jesus is not coming as the Son of Man in the rapture. Okay? He's coming in the second advent to establish the kingdom as Son of Man. It's a messianic kingdom title. So it doesn't relate to the rapture or something like his coming and judgments during the tribulation or anything like that. So the disciples' question here about what is the sign of your coming isn't about the rapture, and it's not about the broad day of the Lord. Okay? It's about the day that he would actually come back to earth. That's what they want to know. What's the sign that you're coming back to earth? And this meaning is consistent throughout. Now the third question about the end of the age. Now this one's very interesting because
it doesn't get much treatment, right? I mean, people just assume. Now, obviously, we all know that in the Jewish mindset, there's really only two ages, right? The age leading up to Messiah, and then there's the Messianic age. That must be in their mind. But can we know more? We can know more because the way that they asked this question is interesting. They didn't just say, was the end like telos, but they used an intensified form of that, soon telos. The soon teleos, the very end. And this is interesting because if you go to Daniel 12, verse 13, you see that Daniel is told, now go your way, for you will be, raised at your proper time for your reward or whatever at the end of the age. And the Septuagint says, eis suntelion hemeron. That is the end day, the very last day. And the question in Daniel 12 is what? What is the last day? Well, Daniel 12:11 told us it's the 1335th day, which is that strange number you see at the end of Daniel, right? That is the very last day. It says, blessed is he who attains to the what? To the 1335th day. It doesn't say, blessed is he who attains to the 1260th day. Now, Jesus comes back, let's say, the day after the tribulation, according to Matthew 24:29. He comes back, let's say, the 1261st day. What is all this deal about another 75 days? Why do we have to have that? Let's just say that Jesus never even addresses Suntelion. He never addresses it in the discourse, the very last day, but he does address the end day. In 24:6, what does he say? This is not yet the end. In 24:13, what does he say? He who endures to the end will be saved. In 24:14, what does he say? The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world, and then the end will come. Tell us in all three cases. He never addresses soon tell us. End is the day he comes back. Soon tell us is the day that the blessings of the kingdom begin. See, because you've got a transitional period. So yes, Jesus most certainly comes in his kingdom on the day he comes. But you have a transitional period to get to the blessing of the kingdom. That's Daniel 12:13 or 12:11. Blessed is he who attains to the 1335th day. It's not enough to make it to the day of the second coming. It's only enough to make it to the 1335th day. Because that's the day you enter into the blessing of the kingdom. And only believers, of course, are going to be a part of that. Only believers. So that means there's got to be transitional issues in the 75 days. And some of those transitional issues are going to be dealt with in this discourse. They're dealt with in other parables too. The wheat and the tares. How is it that he can come in his kingdom and people can still be there that need to be cast out of the kingdom? Well, because Jesus comes in his kingdom on that day. But they have to be cast out because they can't enter into the blessing of the kingdom on the 1335th day. You see? Or something like the wedding banquet in Matthew 22:1-14. He shows up. There's a guy at the banquet, right? He doesn't have the right clothes on, right? So they cast him out of the kingdom. What's this all about? The guy was not prepared. He didn't have the righteousness of Christ. He's not clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Jesus comes in his kingdom and he's still there on earth. He survived the tribulation. But guess what? He wasn't prepared. And therefore he'd be cast out. Because he cannot enter the blessing of the kingdom on the 1335th day. Whether the disciples knew it or not, they're asking about that very end. The Lord never addresses it directly, but Daniel did. And actually, in this discourse, he'll go on to deal with some parables of the householder, the virgins, the talents, and an illustration of the sheep and goats that show there are other transitional judgments that must take place for people who make it to the day of the second coming, but will be excluded from the millennial kingdom blessings. Why? Because they were not prepared with salvation. So the meaning of the three questions, and this is really what's most important to me, is this. I skipped a lot of stuff because I got carried away. That can happen. What they really wanted to know is this. What is the relationship in time between the destruction of the temple and the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And what is that sign, of course? That's part of it. But they want to know this relationship. How did Jesus answer? If you harmonize it with Luke 12, or 21:12-24, you see that in their minds, they thought this was related. The destruction of the temple buildings, that's tied in some way, right, to your second coming and the end of the age? And Jesus said, no, they're not connected. One is in a near time frame. Luke talks about that. Now, the other two are in a far time frame. a generation signified under the illustration of the fig tree that sees all these things. See, they're separated. Connected in the Jewish disciples' mind, disconnected by Jesus. Okay? Now, let's look at his answer. I've discussed how the questions perhaps should be understood. Matthew, we said, doesn't record the answer to the first question, but Luke does. That's been fulfilled. In verse 4, he begins to answer the second question. And I want you to note that if you just think about this passage over and over and over, you will usually come to the conclusion that verse 15 is really important. Almost everybody recognizes this is critical, right? Because it comes right out of Daniel 9:27. Jesus says, Daniel the prophet, and he mentions the abomination of desolation that comes right out of Daniel 9:27. Now, this is controlling the framework. This passage is controlling everything that Jesus speaks of. Okay? So, that's the framework. Now, the view I'm going to present, of course, is that, and I'm expressing it here by ends just so we'll be reviewing what it says. In verses 48, Paul ends said, Jesus describes the signs in the first half of the tribulation. These are not signs for the church, since the church will be raptured prior to the tribulation. These signs parallel Revelation 6. In the second half of the tribulation, verses 9 to 14, the suffering will intensify. Then, verse 9, that marks a transition, referring to the occasion when the Antichrist breaks the covenant with Israel and persecutes the nation. Daniel 9:27. Matthew 24:15 to 26 amplifies the period discussed in verses 9 to 14. 24:9 to 14, Jesus foretold many signs. Now he singles out one sign, the abomination of desolation, verse 15. That is really controlling. That verse is controlling the structure of this section. So let's look at verses 4 to 8. And I'll give you some arguments for why this is the first half of the tribulation. The first one is the linguistic connection throughout this passage of the verb mislead, planao, which is deceive, or be misled. Don't be misled, or don't be deceived. Look, Jesus uses this verb in verses 4, 5, 11, and 24. Now, why is it that all dispensationalists, no, not all, most view the deception in verses 11 and 24 as related to the tribulation time, but some don't connect the deception in verses 4 and 5 to the tribulation time? You see, there is a linguistic connection throughout. And the question is, why is this linguistic connection of be deceived, don't be deceived, throughout the passage, if not to do one thing? Show us the key characteristic of the 70th week of Daniel. The key characteristic of the world at that time will be what? Deception. Now, if we just say, well, verses 4 and 5 are in the church age, and 11:24, that's the tribulation, then what kind of distinction are you making in deception between this age and the one that's to come? What difference are you making between deception in the church age versus deception in the tribulation? The linguistic connection is denying that there is any distinction. It's saying the key characteristic of that future time is deception. We shouldn't dilute that. We should accept the meaning throughout as holding to the same period of time. The second is another linguistic connection throughout the passage of false Christ. Jesus refers to false Christ in verses 5, 23, and 24. Now, why is it that every dispensationalist on the planet holds that verses 23 and 24 false Christ are referring to the tribulation false Christ, but they don't all hold that they are in verse 5? Why? Why, when Jesus is holding this whole section together with a period of false Christ, are we now going to take some of them and spread them out over the church age? See? It seems more consistent, that's all I'm saying. It seems more consistent to say that they're all referring to false Christ in the 70th week, and it's part of the heightened characteristic of deception in that period of time. Third argument. Wars in verse 6 and 7 are explained by the second seal in Revelation 6, 3, and 4 better than they are by World War I and World War II. You know, we have a passage that shows a definite global conflict when the red horse is granted to take peace from the earth. Why not make this connection? It just seems stronger to me. In 24:6, you see it's not yet the end. But by verse 14, look, it says it is the end. Now, doesn't that mean that the entire 70th week is in verses 4 to 14? It seems to make sense. It seems to make a lot of sense. The end is the second coming. It's the end of the birth pangs and the arrival of Messiah. So verse 6, not the end, just the beginning of birth pangs, but verse 14, it is the end. So the entire 70th week has to be there. Even, Whitcomb and Showers and some others who don't hold the view, even like Schofield and Walver, they all recognized that verse 14 is the end. They all said that. Even though they didn't hold this view. They saw, well, it's got to. And I think they're right. Verse 7. Famines, earthquakes. Aren't they perhaps better explained by the third and sixth seals of Revelation 6 than they are present famines and earthquakes? I mean, it's just, shouldn't we make that connection? It seems like the connection is not incidental. It seems like we should connect them and put them in the 70th week. 6. Verse 8 says that everything in verses 4 to 8 are the beginning of birth pangs. Now, that fits really well the analogy of pregnancy. I mean, I was there 5 times, or 4 times, because we have twins. Got 5 kids out of 4 pregnancies. I told my wife that's a good idea, but, you can't make that argument. When? Having to have twins is not always a winner. It's difficult. But the birth pangs, they start in the final hours of labor. Doesn't that fit better when they are seen all down in the 70th week than if we spread them out in some way over portions of the church age? Place them before the week. Especially when we look at birth pangs. Randall Price said this about birth pangs. They are the involuntary and uncontrollable nature of birth pangs, as well as their intensification, leading ultimately to a time of deliverance. Well pictured the concept of a time of divine judgment that must run its course until the promise of new life could be experienced. Should we put these in the church age? It seems more like they're fitting in the 70th week perfectly, and then the new life that's experienced is the kingdom. It's the kingdom that's born. Okay. So that's arguments for the first half of the week being in verses 4 to 8, described as the beginning of the birth pangs. Not all the events of the first half of the tribulation are described in these verses. Just a sampling. Okay. If we were to go to the book of Revelation, then we could go further. We could say, many of it, we think the seals and the trumpets are in the first half. People disagree. But seals and trumpets in the first half. And then verses 9 to 14, that Jesus explains the second half, that's going to correlate, with the period of the bowls. So let's look at the second half of the week, verses 9 to 14. Now, several arguments here to establish this would be the second half. The first is verse 9, the word then, tate, which is the first thing that caught my attention when I studied this years ago. It signifies a transition to things that will take place after the beginning of the birth pangs. See, tate, sometimes the argument is made from the lexicon that tate can mean or signify something overlapping with what came before. So verse 9 is overlapped with the previous verses. But if you study carefully in the lexicon, what it's saying is that an author can be speaking about a past event or sequence of events, and the then will signify something that happens after in that past context. It's not saying that it can overlay with things that are previous. The word has 2 basic meanings. It can mean at that time, emphasizing that you have an event, and then immediately after, on the heels of it, something happens. Or it can just simply mean then or thereupon, meaning something that just follows in time. But either way, you see, it refers to something that follows in time either way. And what then is signifying is that this happens after the beginning of the birth pangs. Verse 9 is not a part of the beginning of the birth pangs. It's a part of the end of the birth pangs that lead into the second half. And by verse 14, we know it's the end because it says it. Second, verse 9 describes perfectly what will happen to the believing remnant of Israel at the midpoint. The you in the verse that are delivered over to tribulation and killed and hated by all nations because of Jesus' name are who? They're the believing Jewish remnant of that future generation being spoken to through the disciples. Okay, that describes exactly what will happen at the midpoint. Again, I mentioned, some people say, well, no, this is the 5th seal. But the 5th seal, if you really are careful with that, you'll realize We don't know when those people are martyred. Obviously, sometime early in the first half of the tribulation, we know that. But really what the seal is this imprecatory prayer that God would ultimately be just and vindicate the shedding of their blood. And you can trace that theme, as I said, down through till you get to Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18, even some into chapter 19. Okay, so it seems that this indicates this is in the second half, not the first, or certainly not during the church age. Now, a third argument is verse 10. Verse 10 is describing this betrayal that takes place after the midpoint between the Jewish people who are aligned with the Antichrist versus those who are aligned with Christ. This takes place in the second half, when there's really only two objects of worship, right? You can only worship the Antichrist and take his mark, or you can worship Christ. And the nation's going to be divided at this time. There's betrayal among them. Okay? That's in the second half. Fourth, verse 11 describes false prophets. There'll be many of them apparently throughout the land. From the context, it seems, prophesied to come among Israel in the second half in Zechariah 13, 2 and 6. Zechariah 13, obviously 12, 13, and 14 are all very close to the end of the second half. It says, "It will come about in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. And if anyone still prophesies, his father and mother who gave birth to him will say to him, 'You shall not live, for you've spoken falsely in the name of the Lord.' And his father and mother who gave birth to him will pierce him through when he prophesies."
Hey, Jeremy, you gotta quit.
Oh, dude.
Time-wise.
Okay, right now? Okay, summary.
Quickly summary so we can have at least 2 or 3 minutes for a quick question.
Okay.
Okay.
Summary. You can always just jab me, it's good.
Okay.
Sorry. Because I have a hard time controlling all these devices, going like this too. Okay, so what I try to do, you get the point. Verse 15 takes everything to the end, right? Verse 15 is no problem because everybody believes that's the midpoint, and everything after that's the second half, so we don't have to go into all that. There's issues about lawlessness, man of lawlessness in the second half there in verse 12 or so. So we've evaluated those views. We've evaluated futurist views only. I hold to the last chronological future first half and second half, and now I just want to read the summary. The second part of the paper emphasizes overall argument of Matthew must be kept in mind throughout. All of the discourses relate to the kingdom in some way, and the Olivet Discourse relates to the events immediately preceding the coming of the king and his kingdom. Jesus was lamenting the fact that that generation rejected. He pronounced judgment on the temple and announced he would not return until the nation welcomes him back. Disciples asked about the timing of the destruction of the temple buildings in relation to the sign of his coming and the end of the age. Jesus' answer was that the temple buildings would be destroyed in a near time frame. That's recorded by Luke. The sign of his coming and the end of the age would occur in a far time frame. The far time frame is held together by the linguistic connection of deception and false Christ throughout the whole passage. Illustration of the fig tree and the statement that that generation that sees all these things will not pass away until all these things take place puts events in a compact time frame. That frame is the 70th week of Daniel. The descriptions of false Christ, deception, wars, famines, and earthquakes are more certainly linked to events in the first half of the 70th week in Revelation 6 than they are to events during church history. Therefore, the first half of the 70th week is described in verses 4 to 8. These are the beginning of birth pangs. The word then in verse 9 transitions to the second half, when the nations of the world will hate the Jewish remnant, deliver them to tribulation and death. This will cause division in the nation, false prophets will abound, so forth and so on, increasing lawlessness, the Antichrist, so forth. Men's level grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be rescued. Okay, so from there on we basically agree. So, one question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And is there a burning question or two out here? Okay, there we go. Because we've got about 2 minutes here for questions.
One word, that would be good. Yes, no questions only.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeremy. This is probably a bit longer than a 1 minute question or a 1 word question. I guess when I've taught this passage, I try to look at the big picture. I appreciate your overview and outline. I'm just wondering if you've done any study or work on some of the other men. You went through and detailed all these things, what their view on in chapter 23, verse 36, it says, "Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." So how they understand this generation as opposed to this generation in verse 34 of chapter 24, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So I'm aware of John Hart's view. Don't really hold that, but how I've taught this is there's three questions: a when and to what, and I see. At least in the overall picture, that the Lord answers all these questions in reverse. So I guess the question of the hour being, what does the phrase "all these things" refer to? And you're going to Luke in presenting that. Have you done any work or considered doing any work from chapter 23 with the little phrase "all these things," tracing that through?
I did in the past when I wrote about all this in preterism. But my thoughts were basically that you have a very unique section in Luke. And if you were going to say that he answers the first question somewhere in Matthew 24 and 25 or in Mark, what is going on in Luke? Where are the exact parallels? That was always my struggle with that first question. Just as far as the first question is, when will these things be? It just always seemed to be the immediate things that were on their mind. It's been criticized that, well, there's not a plurality of things. You're just saying the destruction of the temple is the question. But actually they're asking about the destruction of the temple buildings. And that's exactly what Luke ends up talking about. He gives them events that lead up to the destruction of the temple when it's surrounded by armies and so forth. So to answer your question, I probably didn't answer your question, but because I haven't given enough thought perhaps to your key concern. I'll look into that.
Thank you, Jeremy.
One more,
No.